Hey all you tubers, tuners, and yackers out there. This is grizzly old TubeDude back at you with a segment on pimping your ride. I've put up a few float tube fishing videos in the past few months and been getting a lot of requests to show a few more details on my Escape, which is the float tube I'm currently fishing from. So here's some video showing a walk around plus some other explanations of the various goodies that got mounted on my Escape. Hope you find it entertaining and enlightening. Okay, I've had a couple of requests to show a little bit about how I've tricked out my float tube. This is a North Fork Outdoors Dave Skadden Escape model, and rated for up to 650 pounds, which holds me and my batteries, my motor, rods, tackle, sometimes a few fish. Okay, going around, starting on the right side, you can see the net holder set up, and you can see the basket, which is a 19 by 30 inch basket, which will hold quite a few fish. On a good day, I didn't happen to keep any today. Okay, this is the rod tree on the right side, which can hold 2 rods at different angles, or the same thing on the other side, but can hold 1 rod on either side at different angles. This is my utility rack with a knife and a pair of pliers. This is the utility rod holder for the rod that I'm actually using. And down in my pockets, this is where I keep my trip boxes and my bait container. And I have a float for marking depth. This is my apron when not in use. The front seat is a reclaimed patio chair in red. Cut the legs off, and I put a air mattress cushion in there to maintain a little bit of comfort while I'm out there kicking around. Okay, the batteries. I've got 2 batteries. I've got a Series 27 AGM from Cabela's. That'll run me all day, usually 5 or 6 hours. Got a second battery, which is a 24 amp hour battery. Use that primarily for powering my sonar, but it also has a quick connect that if the main battery should run out, I can connect that up and have enough power to get back in. This is my motor, a Minn Kota Enduramax, 40 pounds of thrust, I guess you call it. And that's infinitely adjustable. You don't have to just click it into different things. You can adjust it down to small increments of 1/2 mile an hour up to 2.5 miles an hour. I put a long extension on the handle, and that's also extendable, so that fits over my shoulder all the time while I'm out fishing. I don't have to reach back for adjusting it. Made my own motor mount out of PVC and wood. I clamped that down, and I also bunch it into place just in case it should accidentally work loose. These are my fins, which are my primary means of propulsion when I'm just working around and fishing. Use the motor mainly for getting from place to place or for bottom bouncing or slow trolling. This is the left side of the tube, missing a rod tube on there. I normally have 4 rod tubes, and I'll usually take a combination of both spinning and bait casting. Sonar, got a nice Garmin Striker 7. Got a lot of different features on it, and that's rigged up so it's infinitely adjustable without a gimbal mount. That works pretty good. Now for the transducer, I've got the transducer on an arm that swings up for launching and beaching, and then down into position when you're out fishing and need it to have a vertical hold. Another thing I've got on my motor, I've installed a little toggle switch that turns the motor on and off, so if you want to stop or start suddenly, you can just flip that toggle switch rather than having to use the controls on the handle. That's put a lot of work in this. I've been doing it for about 60 years and learned how to work with PVC and got a lot of my own inventions. As I tell people, I can't tow a water skier, but I can fish pretty good with it. And this is my rigid apron that I've installed. A little clip over here on one side, clip over here on the other side, and of course the measuring portion for measuring all the big fish. But I can't catch anything over 2 feet or I can't measure it. This rigid board is a lot better than the old fabric aprons that come with most of the tubes. It's really great for handling fish, and if you're working with your tackle, makes it a nice arrangement table to sort your stuff out without it going over the side. So what this is the drawer from a computer table, and used to use the bottom out of a clothes basket, but this works so much better, and it's good and rigid. It's not too heavy, and definitely gets the job done. Okay, this shows the command center. We got the knife, the pliers, got the rod tree with shows it holds 2 rods at different angles. That's good for fishing 2 rods on one side, or you've got the same thing on the other side. You can fish two rods on that side or 1 rod on either side at different angles. And they're very strong reinforced PVC, so they'll handle a pretty good sized fish without the stuff cracking. Pretty proud of that little development myself. And the way they're designed is they're quick draw. You can put the rods in very quickly, and they're at an angle so that when a fish hits, he actually pulls it down and tightens the grip on it, so almost a 0 chance of losing a rod by having them in those quick draw holders. Well, what do you think of that stuff? Now, in the video segment you just saw, you could see the end result of many years experience in float tubing and modifying the tubes that I was using at the time. Now, this segment will try to cover quite a few different topics. First of all, will be my personal history of float tubes and pontoons. It'll cover rod racks, utility racks, sonar setups, aprons, seats, and backrests. It'll cover motors, motor mounts, batteries, that type of thing. Fish handling and control, some different accessories and modifications you might consider, and also transportation, not only getting your float tube from your home to the water, but also from the water to whatever point you want to launch if it's a distance away from your vehicle. Now, for the first 20 years, my float tube history, I was making all my own float tube covers and seats, not just messing around with rod holders and all that stuff. Heck, in my younger and poorer years, I seldom had more than 1 fishing pole at any one time, so didn't need rod holders. After I started buying commercially made float tubes with D-rings, pockets, other refinements, and that gave me the incentive to start adding some more goodies. The last 40 years have seen me go through a whole lot of evolutionary models of different rod racks and tool racks and sonar setups, motor mounts, and that stuff. Now, the remainder of this video is kind of going to be a pictorial trip back through time, showing a lot of the things that I originally pioneered or invented in float tubing. And I won't be putting up detailed instructions or blueprints on exactly how to make all this stuff, but I will show the basics. And if you want to try something, all you have to do is get some PVC and experiment like I've been doing over the last years. However, the last segment of this video will show some basics of working with PVC, like the components, the tools, some of the tricks of cutting, shaping, and joining. So it should help you a bit in that line, and hope it improves your time out on the water. Okay, let's talk about the history of float tubes and pontoons, at least as it relates to my personal history. For my first 20 years of float tubing, I made my own float tubes by adding simple covers and seats to truck tire inner tubes. Nothing fancy. During the last 40 years, I've been buying commercially made tubes and tricking them out in a whole lot of different ways. Now, sorry, I don't have any pictures of some of my early homemade jobs. That was just kind of a quirky hobby then, and I didn't have a camera. But here are a couple of pictures of my first manufactured float tube, the Fishmaster, made by a company down in Oklahoma. It's kind of crude by today's standards, but was a great improvement over the stuff I'd been making. And the cover was rubberized fabric, had a buckled seat, an integral apron, and some pockets. And great stuff in those days. Now, within a few years, there were some other commercially made tubes starting to show up. And my next purchase was an Insel Dry. It was a great design, sturdy nylon cover, great pockets, and some D-rings for hanging goodies from. Too bad there's still such a small market for float tubes in those days because that company went out of business. But I did get a lot of good use out of that float tube for several years into the future. Now, this Ray Scott float tube was bought shortly after the Insel Dry. It was also a great tube and got a lot of use for several years, but sadly it was also a one-tube wonder with no more in the future. After moving to Arizona with its proximity to the fishing the Sea of Cortez in Mexico, I made a couple of other tube purchases, and one was a Browning XL, which took a 22-inch truck tire tube, offered more flotation for a big guy like myself. The other was a Buck's Bag Giant, also a 22-inch tube model. As you can see in the picture, I was also progressing with my pimping. Note the 4-rod rack and the sonar installation with a transducer shaft on the rod rack and a motorcycle 12-volt battery and a little box strapped to the tube. Next came a series of caddis float tubes. Now, these were well made, but fairly inexpensive craft. My wife and I got good use out of several caddis tubes, and this is the red model, again with an early rod rack design and an early sonar setup. This is a brown model caddis with some nice fish from Lake Pleasant in Arizona. This is a green model caddis with a bunch of redfish and sea trout caught while on a work assignment in Louisiana. Of course, I always took my tube and tackle. The next craft, the Kennebec, this marks my departure from the round inner tube models. This mini pond tube had vinyl air chambers instead of the black butyl rubber of the inner tubes. I liked the extra room, but I disliked the stabilizer bar that went across the front. Also disliked how it tracked in any kind of a breeze. The higher profile caught the air and made it tough to steer whenever the air started moving. After only a few months in the Kennebec, I got my first of many Outcast Fat Cats. I really liked that tube from the start. It floated higher, greater weight capacity, and the pointed bow made cruising and steering almost instinctive. Very little adverse effect from any kind of a breeze. And also the pockets were big, and there are lots of D-rings for attaching all of my new modification ideas. And when I moved back to Utah from Arizona, I did bring my Fat Cat, but shortly after settling in, a newfound tubing friend was transferred out of state and sold me his Fish Cat Cougar, which is a pontoon, for a very good price, and I was then a pontooner. I really liked the low-profile design with the twin small pontoons on either side, handled a lot better in the breeze than a single big pontoon, but I didn't like having to use the oars so much. I prefer using my fins for hands-free fishing, so after a while I made someone else a good deal on it and got back in my Fat Cat. My wife and I have gone through several Fat Cats over the years, and the Fat Cats were the first tubes I dared trying to fit with an electric motor. They had the extra space behind the seat for a battery and almost enough flotation. Although I did have to add flotation with some boat bumpers, and I'll be showing that process in the video segment on motors. We also got a couple of Skadden H3 freestyle tubes. They're close to the Fat Cats in size and shape, but the seats turned out to be a disaster. Never could get comfortable in them, and when they finally failed, we went back to Fat Cats pretty fast. One of my other deviations from the Fat Cat was another Skadden craft, the Outlaw Renegade. Again, I bought it from a fishing buddy who developed a health problem and couldn't use it any longer. And I tricked it all out, had some really good fishing from it, but it was just larger enough than the Fat Cat that required a lot more energy to fish with fin power alone. And I never used the oars. I did have an electric motor for longer moves, but I still use fin power for most of my fishing, and a full day and that thing beat me up. I finally escaped. This Skadden craft is a bit bigger than a Fat Cat, but it's still small enough to jockey around while fishing using only fin power. And I totally did away with the small oars that came with it, added a 40-pound electric motor. So I have the option of bottom bouncing or slow trolling in addition to casting and vertical jigging. Been using the Escape for a couple of years now. Have it pretty well tricked out. Let's talk a little bit more about pontoons for a minute. Over the years, as I mentioned, I did have a Cougar, and I liked it for a lot of reasons, but I disliked it for other reasons. But I did learn how to modify a pontoon, and in addition to my own pontoon, I've helped a lot of other guys trick theirs out, and that's what I'll be showing in this segment. One of the things I came up with on my Cougar was a rotary rod rack. Now, this has been adopted by a few guys on their pontoons, a couple of guys on boats, even some ice fishermen that build this into their sled. So it's a pretty good design. But one of the modifications I came up with on the Cougar, well, let's get back. One of the big differences between float tubes and most pontoons is the fact that the latter usually have metal frames. So in order to attach rod holders, sonar, and other PVC goodies, you have to have a method of attaching them to the metal frame. Now, I solved this problem by cutting through a PVC fitting and drilling holes for screwing it down onto the frame. This allows a piece of PVC pipe to be attached so you can add whatever kind of a modification that you want. Here's a picture of a friend's pontoon that I super pimped with PVC fittings all over the frame for rod rack, utility rack, sonar, and so forth. I even added a short oar holder to help keep the oar out of the way when not in use. Here's the same pontoon front view. This is a pic of a pontoon with a 3-rod holder installed in the frame at the rear of the craft, including one tube that's been modified for a fly rod. And here's a pic of a very creative multi-tube rod rack. I can't claim credit for that one. Somebody else did that one. And lastly, here's another one showing a modification of the circular rotating rod rack. Somebody else took that a step further. And lastly, for this segment, a tune with rod holders mounted at the right rear of the craft. Now, the owner was left-handed and casted left-handed, so this makes sense. But you should always have your rod holders on the opposite side from your casting arm. Now, okay, this segment of the video is going to be on rod holders and utility racks, or tool racks. One of the first modifications most tubers, tuners, and yackers attempt is adding some kind of rod holders. And this usually begins with only 1 or 2 rod tubes, which serve not only to hold your rods not in use, but to hold rods while you're fishing or while re-rigging or dealing with a fish you just caught. As the angler's modification skills improve, along with their lust for more rod holders for different applications, the number and type of rod holders usually increases. Now, over the years, I've experimented with a bajillion different designs and combination rod holder setups, and most of them worked well to provide good secure rod holding and more efficient fishing, at least at the time. But my eternal quest for something better has kept pushing me to try new designs. Now, in my early tubing years, I had no need for multi-tube rod racks. In a good year, I owned maybe 2 different rods. And at that time, in Utah, you could only fish with 1 rod at a time anyway, so that was plenty. Thus, my first rod holders were pretty much strictly utility, something to prop my rod up while I was changing rigs or handling fish or moving from one spot to another. This picture shows a slanted strap-on rod holder sold by the Fishmaster Company in the early years. That's what I've got my fish basket propped up on in this picture. And the other rod holder is a piece of PVC plumbing fixture I found at the hardware store and lashed it onto the tube with a piece of white clothesline cord. Utility is another name for active rod holders. These are the holders you use while you're fishing to temporarily hold a rod that you've been actively using. Now, here's another example of one simply lashed onto my tube, in this case a fat cat, several years into the future from the first picture. This is an example of an active rod holder designed to hold a fly rod with a long groove through which you slide the fly reel down for a secure hold. This is a slide-in wooden frame model of an active rod holder. It was also fairly early. It worked well, but added a lot of weight and bulk, so it didn't last too long. The next picture shows a combination of an active rod holder and an active fishing rod holder. The latter is used to hold the rods that are actively being used with a line in the water, either still fishing, drifting, or trolling. The next picture is an active holder designed for drifting, bottom bouncing, or trolling, and if using a spinning outfit, you'd leave the bail closed, and on a bait cast like this one, you keep the spool engaged so that it'll set the hook when a fish strikes. Some of these active fishing rod holders I refer to as bait riggers. They're designed to hold a loose loop of line under a clip with the reel bail open on a spinning reel to allow a fish to move off with the bait until the angler clicks the bail and sets the hook. In this picture, you see my version of a modular strap-on rod holder system. This simple framed holder, once you build it, can be used as either an active fishing holder or a bait rigger, and it can be added or removed to your tube easily once you have it put together. My newest active rod holder addition is a combination. I call it a rod tree. It has holders for 2 rods held out from the tube at different angles for active fishing, and it also has a tube at the top for holding a rod while you're re-rigging or messing around with the fish or whatever. However, the other holders in the rod tree work equally well for holding the rod, an active rod. And I made these from heavy 1-inch Schedule 40 PVC pipe and fittings, so it's extremely strong and has successfully hooked and held some large fish without cracking or breaking. Now, after moving from Utah to Arizona in the early 1980s, had a need for some more different rods for more fishing applications. So I began designing storage rod holders to be able to carry multiple rods on any given trip. And one of my first multi-tube rod holders was this 3-tube PVC model. I'd not yet discovered thin wall 1-inch Class 200 PVC pipe, so it required using bulky and heavy 1 1/4-inch Schedule 40 PVC pipe and fittings in order to have enough inside diameter to hold the average 1-inch rod handle. The next picture is one of the first to include the use of the thin-walled Class 200 PVC pipe, and one of the rod tubes is grooved for a fly rod. It was quick and easy to slip into the 1/4-inch nylon rope loops from the D-rings, and it was both lightweight and sturdy. This is another experimental model with 3 tubes secured to a wood frame using hanger clamps. It worked well. Next is a combo rod rack and sonar transducer shaft setup. Again, one of the tubes is grooved for a fly rod. I tended to use the fly rod a little bit more in my earlier days of float tubing. Now here's one of the more complex models of multi-tube rod holders I have ever made. It has 4 rod tubes screw mounted to a wooden frame, which then slides into another wooden frame that's been securely lashed onto the tube. You note that it's also a combo mount with a vertical sonar transducer shaft integrated into the rod rack. And although it's difficult to see in this picture, the small sonar display is also mounted on the front side of the rack. This shows the rack installed in the frame, along with the more visible elements of the sonar system. And here we have another 4-tube system with green painted PVC tubes, which are lashed to the tube's D-rings. Also note the rotating bungee corded sonar transducer shaft off to the left. That rotated around to become vertical while fishing, and then pull up out of the way when you're launching and beaching. Next, I have a one-time experimental 4-tube holder. It was made of the heavier Schedule 40 1¼ inch pipe and fittings, but then drilled a lot of holes in it to reduce the weight. Held the rods okay, but it was bulky, and it was no better than the lighter class 201-inch pipe, so it didn't last very long. Here's a 4-tube class 200 pipe holder made by using hanger clamps to attach the tubes to a strong PVC baseboard base. And another 4-tube holder with tubes of different lengths secured to a wood frame with hanger clamps. And the reason for the long tubes is that they serve to attach the rack by stabilizing stretch cords to D-rings under the tube, not visible here. And now a modular 4-tube holder. The bottom part is permanently screwed to a wood frame inside the pockets. The top part is then pushed down and snapped down onto the base for mounting. Then there's a similar concept of having a permanent base, but having individual detachable rod tubes which swivel around on the unglued and unscrewed connections. Also note that the permanent attachment includes a sonar display and a transducer mount. On my Escape, my current float tube, I also have a permanent mount for the rod tubes screwed to the wood frame inside the pockets, but each of the long rod tubes just pushes down into the 1-inch PVC base fittings. I remove the tubes after fishing and reinstall them before going out. I've already shown a couple of rod storage setups that included tubes grooved to hold fly rods. Here's a rod holder with a couple of different ways to carry fly rods. And here's a rod holder for a tuber who uses fly rods almost exclusively and not spinning or bait casting. And this is a rear mount directly behind the seat. Now here's a fly rod rack back slanted on the left side of the tube for an angler who apparently casts right-handed. This is another one of my experimentals, a horizontal rod rack. Hold any kind of a rod, and it was designed for simplifying fishing under trees or going under structures. And a horizontal rack that slants upward away from the tube for easier rod visibility and selection. Here's the horizontal upward slant in action on Lake Pleasant in Arizona. It worked well until I tried backing into shore with a steep bank. That's kind of tough on rod tips. This is the rotary rod rack I designed for mounting onto the rear deck of a pontoon, but it also works on kayaks and boats and has been adapted by a lot of ice fishermen for use in their ice fishing sleds. These are examples of commercially available rod holders if you don't want to make your own. These can be attached to your float tube in a variety of ways, and pretty easy to use if you can or won't make your own. This last picture on this section is a multi-tube vertical rod storage system, which is easily mounted on a boat deck. You probably never get away with that on a float tube. Okay, now let's talk about utility racks. And it was only natural once I got going with adding rod racks that I also began adding tubes to hold pliers, nets, fish grippers, and other goodies I needed while fishing. This first combo model was much like some of the first rod holders. It's made from the heavy 1 1/4 inch Schedule 40 PVC and fittings. Then the two ends were slipped down into nylon rope loops attached to D-rings on the tube. Simple but effective. This model was made to be a combination rod holder and tool rack, including a rod holder for a fly rod. This one includes a swiveling but rear-facing net holder. And here's another combo tool rack, net holder and rod holder, painted pretty red. Like many other tube-mounted models, it simply slips down into nylon rope loops tied onto conveniently spaced D-rings. This is another combo model, but permanently anchored to the removable pockets on my Renegade, screwed into the wood frame inside the pockets. This combo rack is on my current ride, the Escape, and it uses the same principle of screw anchoring the rack to a wooden frame inside the pockets, but each of the component parts is not glued or screwed to the anchored frame. They snap on and off for fishing or stowing, and they rotate to provide easier access. One utility item not seen on any of the previous examples is a rear view mirror. Now, this little item really helps when returning to the ramp or for watching behind you when you move around in reverse. It's amazing how many times silly boaters like to move in right behind you and then accuse you of not looking where you're going. Silly boaters. Okay, let's talk about sonar setups on a float tube. What do you have to do to get it to work? We'll be talking about basic installations, batteries, transducers, everything that goes into the system. And my first exposure to sonar came while I was fishing in a friend's bass boat in Utah during the early 1980s. His first sonar was a paper graph model. The next was a flasher type. And although rude and crude by today's standards, these early models showed me the advantages of having some electronic assistance on the water. Now, my first attempt at float tube sonar was the cheap flasher unit. And for battery power, I got 12 volts by rigging two 6-volt lantern batteries in series. And I just balanced the display box on the top of my tube while fishing and almost lost the display overboard a few times. Also, the two lantern batteries didn't last very long and they became an added expense about every other trip. Let's talk about installations. When Eagle first came out with some small, simple LCD sonar units, my mind kicked into gear and I worked out a way to mount one on my tube. And for power, I graduated to one of the old acid-filled motorcycle batteries. It worked, and I was forever in the sonar business on future tube trips. As time went on, the sonar industry grew and progressed, and with more and more small and affordable units available, I like the little CUDA models for float tubes. And when I discovered 12-volt SLA batteries, I no longer had to worry about spilling acid from the motorcycle batteries. So things were looking better for me in sonar. This picture shows how I was able to make everything quickly and easily installed and detached and stowed in a side pocket on the float tube when not in use. Here's a picture of one of the larger screen CUDAs installed. The main thing I wanted to illustrate with this picture is that in the early model years, there wasn't the high-tech target displays that there are these days. All the targets are shown as little fishy pixels in about 3 different sizes. And the main problem was that an underwater tree branch or a stream of bubbles or anything else in the water column other than fish still showed up as a school of fish. So you had to learn how to interpret and second guess what was really on the screen. One of my next upgrades was a Hummingbird 565. By now, sonar units were providing digital displays of water temperature and depth and so forth, as well as the signals for the fishies. And it also showed a lot more of the bottom contours too, which was a big help when you were fishing fish near the bottom. My first entry into the color sonar market was a Hummingbird Helix 5. And it was really amazing to see the better definition of bottom conditions, suspended fish, and other targets made it a lot easier to understand what was in the watery world below me. For some time now, I've been using the Garmin Striker 7. I can't believe I ever thought I was fishing before getting this unit. And now, the traditional sonar display shows only what is below you at the time, but the Garmin Striker has most of the latest bells and whistles, so you can choose from a lot of different screens. There's GPS, side scan, multiple other screen options with time display, speed display, and so forth. Oh yeah, it also shows a lot better picture of the fish life below me, and still have to do some interpreting, but it's a lot easier once you learn the system and you're able to profile what the display shows along with what is going on or not going on the end of your line. Okay, on the subject of batteries, going back to the picture of my first sonar setup, you can see the acid-filled motorcycle battery propped up in the plastic file card box on the top of the tube. And when using a low-power early sonar, I found I could get by with using a smaller battery. This is a 4.4 amp-hour battery, and on those low-power ones, it'll still hold up for at least a full trip without failing. But it wasn't long before I fully went into using 7 amp-hour batteries. These are the SLA, sealed lead acid. They're not deep cycle batteries, but if you take care of them, they will hold up for several seasons of use. And the key is to top them off before a trip and then fully recharge them just as soon as you get home from a trip. Now, some folks use little alligator clips to attach to their batteries. I prefer the little electric connectors shown in the picture. They're a lot more secure and less easily detached, especially if you use a little solder on them. For extra protection for your battery, while in the pocket of your tube, pack it inside a small rigid container like a plastic file box. This picture shows a bucket tucked behind the seat of a fat cat with both a battery for the electric motor and one for the sonar. Now that's actually a pretty small battery for an electric motor. It's only 33 amp hours, but it works fine for short trips in which you won't be using a lot of battery power. But we'll talk about motor batteries later. Okay, transducers. Transducers are the eyes of your sonar system. They send out the electronic beams that, when returned, they're interpreted by the brains of the system and displayed visually on your screen. In this picture, you see an early form of transducer mounting. It employs a PVC shaft with a transducer on the end and stretch cords stretched to each end of the shaft and run around the tube. Now, this allows it to be rotated out of the water when you're launching or beaching, but then lowered back into the vertical position during use. Here's the same setup, top view. And in this picture, the transducer shaft is attached to a wood frame at the end of a rack with clips. And so it can be raised or lowered or removed if desired. Now this is one of many transducer mounts I've used that rely on pushing the connections together without screws or glue, so that the transducer shaft can rotate up or down freely or be detached. This is another one attached to a base screw mounted into a wood frame inside the pocket. This transducer mount on my former Renegade had the transducer actually mounted inside the air chambers rather than on the outside. There's plenty of room inside, so it was never a problem. And on my current ride, the Escape, I have the transducer once again mounted outside on a swiveling mount, and it works great. Okay, now let's talk about motorizing a float tube. I fished from plain old non-motorized float tubes for most of my tubing career. Made a lot of noise about float tubes not being suitable for motors. If you wanted a motor on your craft, you should buy a boat. But all that was during the years when I was still fishing from a donut, round float tube. After I became a die-hard Fat Cat fan, my thinking began to change a little bit. Fat Cats had a greater weight capacity, plus I had a storage space in the nose between the seat and the pointed end. That'd easily hold a battery, if only I could come up with some way to mount a motor. Well, I did, several ways. And during the past few years, I've motorized quite a few float tubes, not only for my wife and myself, but for quite a few other float tubers as well. Now, there's several manufacturers of electric trolling motors. I've always been partial to the Minn Kotas. And for powering my float tube, the first I chose was the Endura 2 and a 30-pound thrust. Worked well, had all the power I needed, but because I'm tall and because the 30-pound motor only had a 30-inch shaft length, I upgraded to the 40-pound thrust. And that was not because I wanted more power, but because the shaft length was 36 inches, 6 inches longer. And that additional length was perfect for my frame, and the motor handle comes over my shoulder just right. Now here's my current motor. It's the Minn Kota Enduramax, also on a 40-pound thrust. It gives a much longer battery life because it has what they call a potentiometer that uses only the power needed for any selected speed. Now, most other motors put out the same power at all speeds, and any extra power not needed is converted to heat, or something like that. And I can also make minor adjustments in the speed on my Enduramax without having to use only the preset click controls of slow, medium, and fast. And this works great when I'm slow trolling or bottom bouncing and using the speed on my sonar GPS speed indicator. I love it. Now, the first thing I had to do to a new motor when I'm putting it on a float tube is to reverse the head. Electric trolling motors are designed to fit on the transom at the rear of a boat, with the handle pointing forward and the propeller pushing the boat forward. Now, in a float tube, we're going backwards. So in order to get the propeller pushing backwards, we need to reverse the handle to face forward. Simple to do by removing the single nut and bolt which secures the head in position, turning it 180 degrees, then reattaching the nut and the bolt. This is one of my earliest attempts at making a motor mount from PVC, what else? It's very basic in shape and function. It was a frame to distribute the weight of the battery inside the tube and a piece of wood to which I could attach the motor. This is what it looked like with the motor and battery and a stowed PFD. Not pretty, but it got the job done. My next motor mount was a bit longer, with the battery beneath the PVC, and the front edges of the PVC frame were flattened with a heat gun to slide it under the seat for a more secure hold. And then I added some half-inch PVC stabilizers at the corners where there was the most stress. This made for a very solid mount. Now, although the Fat Cats do have a larger weight capacity, it was still necessary to add some extra flotation to the front of the tube where all the weight of the motor and the battery could be a problem. I took care of this by lashing two large inflatable boat bumpers under the nose of the tube. Worked like a charm. The whole thing floated level. That was before I got in the tube. Now, another experiment was a compact motor mount for the Fat Cat, and the battery just rested in the pocket behind the seat with no restraint or support. It worked. but still had to have the boat bumpers under the frame. And this is how they looked secured to the D-rings under the tube. Now my final and best design for motorizing a Fat Cat was the Mega Mount. This was a one-piece, all-inclusive setup, which incorporated both the flotation with the motor mount. It was tied down with D-rings on the bottom of the tube, and then brought up around the front and secured topside. It was neat and clean, very secure, and I immediately started getting requests to make them for other float tubers for different models. Now, beside my motor mounts for float tubes, I also came up with some designs for pond tubes, which are hybrid float tubes and pontoons, or frameless pontoons, some people call them. The first was for my Renegade. Even included a fancy PVC battery holder. My final and most recent motor mount design is for my current ride, the Escape. It's modeled heavily after the one I made for his big cousin, the Renegade. Served me well for a couple of years, and as long as I properly secure it with straps, so to the D-rings provided, it's rock solid. Okay, now let's talk about batteries. My first battery for a float tube motor was a hand-me-down used car battery. It was built for cranking power, not the deep cycle properties needed for marine batteries, which are usually drained and then recharged to capacity. Now the car battery worked, but only briefly. It died an early death. At that time I had no intention of doing any controlling or bottom bouncing from my float tube, so figured I could get by with a smaller battery. I bought a little 33 amp hour battery designed for golf carts and other similar electric powered contrivances, and it worked really great on all the trips I made with it. But as I learned to appreciate the new horizons provided by having a motorized float tube, I lusted for more power and a longer life battery. My first upgrade was an 80 amp hour deep cycle battery, and it worked great, but it wasn't long before I also got a larger 115 amp hour battery. And then I got 3 Series 27 AGM batteries from Cabela's. There's one each for me and my wife, and a spare to carry for longer days on the water. I continued to use the AGM battery through my years in a Fat Cat, and I finally graduated it to my Escape when I got that. Now just recently I bit the bullet. I took out a third mortgage and bought a new 100 amp hour lithium battery. So far I love it. It's only about a third the weight of the heavy AGM battery, and it delivers constant power through the full range of charge, and it recharges in much less time than the AGM. And one of the first things I discovered after successfully mounting a motor on the float tube was that reaching the handle control could be problematic. Most electric motors have a sliding adjustment on the handle to elongate them a bit, but not quite long enough for the distance between the motor mount on a float tube and the angler's seat. So I needed some kind of an extension so I could turn the motor on and off and adjust the speed as well as steer my tube. Now, I knew there were commercially sold extension handles I could buy, but I prefer to be called frugal, not just cheap. So I figured I could come up with a solution without enriching greedy manufacturers. My first attempt was to simply attach a couple of feet of heavy-duty clear 1-inch plastic tube I had laying around. Had to split it, wrap it around the end of the handle, and then secure that with a hose clamp. But it worked, but not well. Had to put a lot of torque on it to get it to turn. Next was a kind of a crank contraption I made from PVC. What else? Used a heat gun to bend the end appropriately, and attached it to the motor handle with a piece of 1-inch PVC. Split that and then secured it with another hose clamp. It worked, but was sometimes cumbersome and got in the way. Next was a jointed but straight PVC extension. The joint helped a bit, but it still wasn't perfect. And then I discovered a flexible blue conduit pipe. Electricians call it Smurf pipe from its blue color. I attached a piece of 1-inch PVC on one end, split it, and anchored it to the motor handle with the old standard hose clamp. It required very little effort to turn it, but if you bent it too far to make a turn, the pipe would break at one of the rings. That was a bummer. I liked it, but I hated it. Had a few trips interrupted by having to stop and take apart the Smurf pipe and the PVC connection and reconnect the unbroken end of the PVC. Now, once I spent the bucks for my Escape and got an upgraded Endura Max 40-pound motor, I figured I could handle paying for a good quality motor control handle extension. I did it, and I'm glad I did it. It really works well. Okay, let's talk about motor switches. Electric trolling motors do have a control handle which you can rotate to turn the motor off and on or adjust the speed, unless it's a foot pedal operated. But sometimes it's handy to also have a simple on and off switch that you can click to shut off the motor without having to work the control handle, and to be able to keep the speed setting if you're trolling. This picture shows the little on and off switch I've used for several years and how I mount it. This is a close-up. It's known collectively as a Bigfoot switch, and was originally designed for boaters who didn't have the foot controls for their electrics but wanted to be able to turn them off and on without reaching back for the control handle. Similar switches are available from several manufacturers, but you can install any switch that you can wire into the motor wires to handle the amperage of the 12-volt motor you're using. This last picture is a small 12-volt toggle switch I tried briefly. It worked, but only briefly, so I retired it and went back to the Bigfoot. Okay, that's it for motorizing float tubes. Float tube power. Now we'll talk about aprons, seats, and backrests. All these things are kind of related to functionality and comfort. And comfort while spending a full day in the water in a float tube is pretty important. And since all anglers are built differently and have different comfort requirements, it can sometimes take some minor to major modifications to your seating setup to get the maximum comfort. Now, let's talk about aprons first. The first float tube I bought commercially was a Fishmaster, and it was made of rubberized fabric, very crude by today's standards, but it did have an integral apron, and I made great use of it for handling fish and sorting tackle and baiting up, and for reducing the amount of stuff I dropped into the water. As more tube models entered the market, most of them featured some kind of a mesh apron, some with fish measuring numbers on them. They're often not permanently attached to the tube, but had to be fastened either with clips or with stretch cords. While the flimsy mesh aprons were adequate dealing with wimpy fish like trout, they're sometimes problematic with spiny rayed fish like bass, sunfish, or catfish, and they offered no protection to either the angler or the tube. And as my wife and I found out, if a spiny fish dropped onto the tube, it invariably landed spines first. It's like butter bread always lands butter size down. And spines and inflatables don't get along very well together, so we started laying a naga hide apron over the front of our tubes whenever we're fishing in spiny fish waters. Saved us a lot of hasty kicks back to shore as air was escaping from our float tube from fish spine holes. Mesh aprons also didn't offer a very firm surface for messing with tackle or subduing fish, so I decided I want a rigid apron. I rigged up a lid from a plastic storage container, and here's my wife with one of our first what we call sushi boards. Note the lure boxes and bait containers on her apron. It makes a handy little work table. Here's another lid from a plastic storage bin with a yardstick measure attached. and a nice wiper being measured. Another of my rigid apron experiments was to cut the bottom out of a white plastic laundry basket. The raised edges help keep things on the apron a little bit better, and the holes I drilled around the outside help drain off any water that might get in it. Still another entry in the sushi board lineup was the bottom cut out of a clear plastic storage bin. And like the others, it worked well. Just another experiment. My current apron on the Escape is the ultimate. It's very solid and rigid, and it's a plastic computer keyboard tray designed for installing on slides or rollers under a desk. That turned out to be the perfect size for my larger ride on the Escape. Okay, now let's talk about seats and backrests. Coming up with a comfortable but efficient seat was probably one of the biggest concerns I had when designing and making my own float tubes 60 years ago. But even though modern design usually did a pretty good job of making functional seats, I never bought one that I didn't need to modify somehow to make it more comfortable for my large and aging body. This picture shows the raised backrest made from a half-inch PVC pipe and a piece of foam swim noodle. And like most float tube seats, this one on the H3 Freestyle was too short for my large frame and didn't offer any upper back support. So the seat cushions on this model were also problematic, and ultimately they were the reason why my wife and I didn't really fish from these float tubes very long. Here's one attempt at making the H3 seat more comfy. A cut-down patio chair. Here's another try on the H3 with a patio chair, but with a higher back. It also worked. Here's still another seat modification with a cushioned office seat rest. And that turned out to be about the most comfy, and I actually carried it forward and used it on some fat cats in the future. One more entry in the HC Comfort campaign. Legs removed from an office chair. And like most of the others, it worked better than the original, but I still kept looking. We finally bailed out of our H3s when the corrugated seams on the bottom part of the seat cushions separated and turned into a big round ball instead of the comfy compartments. You got to be comfortable while fishing, or it gets to be more a matter of endurance than enjoyment. We went back to our trusted fat cats, but still continued our quest for the ideal seating situation. Here's a contour plastic stack chair with the legs removed. Actually one of our experiments, but I lost it when another tuber tried it out and wouldn't return it. In fairness, though, he did pay me for it. I've tried other things, like this folding seat cushion and a metal frame folding stadium chair. I know several other tubers who use these and find them to be a good comfy seat with good back support. This is a contoured boat seat, available online for boaters who need to replace their originals. It's small, lightweight, and comfortable. Notice the seat extension on my Escape. Without it, the seat's too short for my long frame when I have the seat positioned to hold a battery behind the seat for my electric motor. And this do-it-yourself extension solved the problem. Last in the line of seat enhancements is the red patio chair I got to match my red Escape, and cut the legs off and plopped it in. Note the folded up air mattress cushion I added. It makes it very comfy, and I've since removed the two side arms to provide more room inside the tube. Makes it even more comfy and less interference with getting things out of the pockets on the sides of the tube. Well, that finishes up this segment. Okay, this segment is on fish handling and control. And if you go fishing to catch fish, you should be prepared to handle and control them as you bring them into your float tube. Being knowledgeable and properly equipped will benefit you, also benefit your craft and your tackle, and also the fish, especially if you plan to release them. Now in this segment, we'll discuss fish nets, grippers, stringers, and fish baskets. If you're catching small fish without potentially dangerous spines, it's usually okay to just hoist them up over the side and into your tube. But if you're catching lots of spiny rayed fish or larger, more rambunctious fish, you find it easier and less damaging to you, your craft, or the fish, or if you use a good net. This picture shows an example of what I call old school net. Got a short handle and it's got nylon mesh. Now, short handles are more compact and easier to handle on a float tube, but sometimes prolong the battle and lose fish if you can't reach a large overactive fish in time and he comes undone. And the nylon mesh also more easily tangles up with fish and with lures, especially the ones with treble hooks. Now, even though it can be less handy to deal with longer handle nets on a float tube, in the long run it'll help you be more efficient in netting and controlling fish. And a rubber mesh bag is also easier on both the fish and your tackle, being much less prone to tangles and snagged hooks. And you'll also note in this picture the addition of a piece of foam swim noodle to prevent loss of the net in case you drop it overboard. The size of your net is also important. If you're going out after trout or smaller species, similar net is okay. But if your likely catch is going to include bigger fish, especially rambunctious catfish, then a bigger net is definitely in order. Bigger nets are more difficult to carry and use on a float tube, but they're much better to have than the alternative of losing fish or losing a battle with one anyway. A lot of ways to carry a net on a float tube. Some guys just lay one across the back of their tube. A lot of my net holders feature backwards slanting tubes to keep the net out of the way of the wild casts. But I've also installed net holders facing forward, or in this case on a free swiveling mount, so you can rotate it forward or backward. Just pay attention to where the net is when you're casting. Here's a pic of the rubber mesh long handle net I use most often on my escape, mounted so that it faces out to the rear, but within easy reach when it's needed. Now, if you don't have a net, you can either lift the fish on board if small enough, or grab it if it's not too spiny, or lip it unless it has powerful jaws and or a lot of teeth. Now, in the latter instances, you'll benefit by having a mechanical lip gripper. These come in a lot of different sizes and shapes and materials. This first example is of a metal one, and they do work fine, but they increase the risk of damage to the fish if you plan to release it. And they're also heavy and they tend to sink quickly if you drop them overboard. I kind of prefer the plastic models. They come in several colors, and besides being easier on the fish, they also float if you drop them in the water. Now we get into stringers and baskets. If you plan to keep some fish while fishing from your tube, you'll need a safe and effective method of keeping them until you return to shore. Some tubers still prefer hanging a stringer over the side, and there are a lot of different kinds of stringers. But I almost never use any kind of stringer anymore. But on occasion, like when I have a damaged basket or if I've left it behind, I'll put my fish on a short rope stringer. Now, this is not a good idea because fish on a rope stringer will do their best to wrap up your legs. And if your legs are wrapped up, you don't got no more power. Beginning with my very first float tubes, I've always preferred to hang a metal fish basket over the side of my tube in which to drop my fish. There are a lot of sizes and designs in these fish baskets. I prefer the large 19 by 30 inch without a floating lid. Here's pictorial proof of a fish basket on my first commercially purchased float tube back in the late 1970s. This is how I normally rig them up for my float tube. I put a piece of swim noodle around the neck for flotation, and then I run a piece of nylon rope around inside the foam and add a clip on the end of a piece of cord to secure it to a D-ring. By the way, I also use the small zip ties to securely close that bottom trap door on these metal fish baskets. Otherwise, your more rambunctious fish will find a way to dive down, flip up that lid, and do a Houdini on you. Here's one way to hang a fish basket off of your tube. I used that for a while, but I currently prefer to snug it up a little bit closer and secure it in a couple of places. Keep the basket upright when you're moving through the water. Now, if you allow the basket to tip over and straighten out level, the fish will be a lot more tempted to jump or swim away, and it'll be a lot easier for them to do so. Now, the large 19 by 30 inch baskets will hold a pretty fair amount of fish. I regularly bring in a limit of 8 good-sized catfish, and all are alive and well when I escort them to the cleaning station. Can't ask for more than that. So that pretty much concludes a segment on fish handling and control. Well, this segment will be about accessories and modifications. Now, each of these categories is really not large enough to deserve a separate video section by itself, but each has been a part of my float tubing experience. Let's start with fins. I've gone through a whole bunch of different fins through the years. In some cases, I broke them or wore them out. In other cases, I lost one or both through whatever reason, but in still other cases, I bought a new pair just to try them out, always looking for something better. This is one of the first sets of fins I bought to use with my new float tube, the Fishmaster. And these fins are made of a stiff, hard, heavy rubber by the Voigt company. And they worked, but they beat me to death powering them around for any length of time. I passed them on to my young and robust teenage son, who was glad to get them. One of the next sets of fins I bought were the IDI frogfoot fins. These were a lot lighter and more flexible. The only downside was that the largest size I could get was a size L, large. I had a size extra large foot. And by the time I added waders and a pair of booties to my feet, really cramped inside the foot pockets. So that's why I cut out the toes, as you can see in this picture. That helped, but it still made for a lot of discomfort, especially in cold water situations. After moving from Utah to Arizona, I visited a skin diving shop. They were becoming newly popular, and found some Mari's Plana Avanti dive fins. They had a nice soft foot pocket, came in an extra large, and they had an easily adjustable strap that would allow me to adjust the fit and fish in all seasons with the changing bulk of my footwear needs. Well, during my happy days with Mari's fins, there began to be a lot of buzz about force fins. I bought a pair, tried them, didn't really like them, although they do have a big fan club. My personal evaluation at the Mari's had more thrust per amount of effort spent, and that can be important in a long day of fishing. Over the years, I bought several more pairs of Mari's fins, some slightly different models and colors. Most have been blue. I did have a set of the black pair. For some silly reason, those black fins were attractive to carp, and on several occasions I had big old carp roll up against my fins and scare the heck out of me. But they worked great, until a loose strap on one made them no longer a pair. If I ever lose a leg, I really have it made because I got several single fins. Also had a pair of bright yellow Mari's, not because I wanted yellow, but because that was the only color available in extra large when I had to buy a new pair. And not sure whether the bright color attracted or repelled the fish. Usually did as well with them as with the other colors, no better, no worse. Today I still use the blue Mari's, probably the 8th or 10th pair I bought. They still provide comfortable finning during all months of the year and all footwear conditions. Now let's talk about inflation. No, not the national economy, but how to air up our float tubes. During the early years of float tubing, our air chambers were just truck tire inner tubes, so standard tire pumps and later the electric compressors all worked to put us afloat. But once we got into vinyl air chambers and the different kind of valves, we also got a whole new assortment of air pumps, manual and power. This picture is of a couple of the hand pumps I used to take with me for airing up my fat cats. The big one was a high volume pump for major air ups. The smaller one is sometimes carried on my tube in case of a leak or a reduction in pressure due to a temperature drop. Some tubers like the foot pumps. They work, but I still prefer the high-volume hand pumps. One of the best I found is a K-pump. Has a universal fitted head for the modern valves, and it really pumps up a tube quickly. Either that or helps you top one off that you've carried partially inflated in your vehicle on the way to the water. For the past few years, I've been relying heavily on 12-volt high-volume air pumps, like the Airhead pictured here. But you don't have to pay high prices for the most expensive on the market. There are a lot of options. This is the one I use now. Bought it off Amazon for about 2/3 the price of an Airhead. And speaking of inflation, let's look at properly measuring fish. I'm not saying that reputable anglers would inflate or distort the actual size of a catch, but having an accurate form of measurement with a picture gives a lot more credibility to your fish stories. And the simplest way to measure is with a retracting tape measure or even one of the cloth models. Here's a picture of a yardstick measurement on one of my sushi board aprons. And here's a folding yardstick I made by sticking a 36-inch fish measuring tape for boats onto a 36-inch piece of wood that I had already cut in two and joined with hinges. Folds up to 18 inches when not in use and tucks easily into a side pocket. And here's a picture of the bump board I made for photographically recording my catches for a website catfish contest. It's made from wood hinges and yardsticks, although I have since added on one of the aforementioned boat fishing measure tapes. This is what it looks like mounted on the front of my float tube. And then there's painting. Why go fishing in a plain vanilla craft when you can dress it up with additional color, right? Well, that's what my wife and I thought when we decided to paint PVC rod holders and tool racks and even add some painted designs to our fat cats. Today there are lots of options and types of paints and exotic colors. Here's a special red paint made for plastics that I use for painting our white PVC stuff. This is a red rod rack, red utility rack, and a pretty green utility rod rack on my fat cat. Now, after that, we got some special fabric paints and put designs on our float tubes. This is my wife's float tube with multicolored flames. And here she is in her pink rod rack, and the float tube's quite colorful. Of course, I had to get in on the fun, so I painted a set of shark jaws on my tube. And here I am in all my glory with the shark jaws and a green rod rack. Pretty, huh? There are a lot of other add-ons, gadgets, and modifications you can include in your onboard ensemble. Now, not every float tuber will want all of them, but some will want all of them and more. By the way, there are no laws regulating carry-on stuff for float tubes, and the following list is by no means in order of importance. Here's a good example of a kayaker who wanted all of the techie bells and whistles assembled in one easy-to-see and easy-access location. You can see a rear-view mirror, a compass, GPS, walkie-talkie, sonar display, and so forth. It's no wonder there was no room left for the big flat-screen TV. For more normal float tubing, whatever that is, let's start with GPS. If you have a sophisticated sonar system, chances are you already have GPS available on that unit. Otherwise, you can buy handheld GPS fairly reasonably. It's great to have for marking your favorite spots or for finding spots which others have provided the numbers. And then there are radios and walkie-talkies. Simple and inexpensive units are all you really need to communicate with fellow tubers on the water. And having some communication is often very helpful in putting everybody on fish or warning of problems or calling for help. And having a small canned air horn is another way of communicating or warding off errant boaters who fail to see your vulnerable float tube and are about to run over you. Some tubers just settle for a loud whistle they can blow. Next, let there be light. Even if you don't deliberately go fishing at night, it's possible you might get caught on the water after the sun goes down. Now, most states have laws about having specific navigation lights for watercraft on the water after dark, but at the very least you should have a good bright flashlight both for finding your own way and for warning other watercraft of your presence. And a good headlamp can be invaluable when dealing with fish or rigging tackle after dark. Next on the list would be PFDs, personal flotation devices. Most states have requirements that you have to have one on board for each person in a watercraft. Of course, in a float tube, that only means one. And you can either wear it, like I am in this picture, or stow it for easy access. The older model PFDs were big and bulky and not comfortable to wear while tubing, but the newer inflatable PFDs are compact and affordable and should be worn. Here's a picture of how I used to stow mine before getting an inflatable and wearing it. Never had to use it, and I'm not sure how well I would have accessed it or put it on in an emergency. Sun protection on the water is important. Besides using a good sunscreen on exposed skin surfaces, you should also have a good hat, either with a wide brim or one like this one with a big front bill and a net covering fabric flap behind. A lot of flotation anglers prefer to use the thin, light fabric head coverings like buff, like this one. Another head covering would be a bug net. You need these at times, not only to ward off biting insects, but to keep swarms of gnats or midges from getting in your eyes, ears and mouth, and generally driving you bonkers. And don't forget sunglasses. They're good not only for protecting your eyes, but for being able to see into the water better under most conditions. Your hands may need protection too. Don't forget them when applying sunscreen, especially on the backs of your hands. But depending on the type of fish you'll be catching in the numbers, you might want to add a protective glove on your fish holding hand. This is a cut down plain cotton glove that I sometimes wear to reduce what I call fish rash when handling lots of spiny sunfish or perch. And if you're silly like me, like to fish early and late in the year in cold water climates, you might need gloves for warmth. Fingerless fleece gloves are popular with many cold water anglers. And so are neoprene gloves. Sometimes these are best not only for keeping your hands dry and warm, but also for cutting down the effects of a cold breeze. If you're really sensitive to cold, you might even wish to carry hand warmers. The one on the left is refillable with fluid and you have to light it. The one on the right is for one-time use and then proper ecological disposal. There are also rechargeable electric models on the market. If you have room in your craft or backpack, carrying a small first aid kit is a good idea. All kinds of accidental pokes and cuts and scrapes are possible on fishing trips for either you or your fishing companions. Now, whenever you're casting or vertical jigging, it's a good idea to have a marker buoy to mark the location of any fish you find, either on your sonar or where you got your last bite. And you can carry one or two of these easily in the pockets of most float tubes. Just keep them handy for quick tossing when you find fish. Since most float tubes move backwards, you should have some means of checking what's behind you, like a rearview mirror. This is especially helpful when navigating through other watercraft or when returning to the ramp to take out your tube. This is a wide-angle model, and if you're float tubing in Jurassic Park, be sure to watch out for T-Rex. Here's an item most float tubers wouldn't think of until they need it: a tow rope. Now, you don't need one often, but sometimes either you or a companion might have a physical or equipment problem that makes it necessary to provide some assistance. I've used mine even to tow a disabled boat and to be towed by a boat in a high wind before becoming motorized. This is me towing my wife back after she had a motor failure. We're about a mile from the ramp. Now, if you're young and healthy, have a good back, you might not ever need a tool for helping you put on or take off your swim fins. But I'm old with poor flexibility, so this simple PVC tool helps a lot. Then there are cameras. Over the years, I've collected thousands of pictures of every phase of float tubing, without which I could never make a video like this. And recently, I got my video camera. So you don't have to be a Hollywood producer to justify having these things. Just use them and set up a good filing system for future reference. Last but not least is hydration. Now, the last thing you need when wearing waders in a float tube is more calls of nature. So it's wise to limit your liquid intake both before and during a float tube trip. But you also need to stay hydrated, especially on hot days. So it's a good idea to always carry water, either in a metal bottle, a plastic bottle, or disposable. And those with clips you can clip onto a D-ring, but the latter you'll have to stow in a pocket somewhere. Well, that pretty much concludes the valuable necessities. Okay, let's talk about transporting your tubes, either by vehicle, by carrying them yourself, or with various carts and wheels. Before you can start fishing, you have to get your tube to the water. Now, this usually breaks down into two separate transportation components. First, from your home to wherever you park near the water, and secondly, from wherever you park to the place that you want to be launching your float tube. Now, here are over about 30 pictures showing my evolutionary journey and the best ways to get my tubes from point A to whatever other point I needed to get them. Now, most small to mid-sized float tubes can be transported from home to water in the family vehicle. Now, this is one of my fat cats in the back of my Blazer, which is an SUV. Now, it was usually partially deflated to fit a little bit better, and fully inflated when ready to launch. Now, if you have a bigger tube or multiple tubes and or a standard auto with only a trunk, then you might likely need to deflate them totally before you transport them. Another option, if you have a car top carrier, is to secure your load up on the top for quick deployment when you get to the water. Now, if you don't have a car top carrier, be sure to put down a protective pad of some sort before putting your craft on a painted surface. If there's sand and grit on the bottom of your tube, it definitely won't improve your rooftop finish. This picture shows how I secured my Cougar pontoon when I had it. And of course, if you have a wide bed pickup, you have it made. Even with a longer pontoon, you just leave the tailgate down and securely tie the craft in place before heading down the road. And don't leave anything else in the back that might blow out while you're speeding down the freeway. If you have a tow hitch on your vehicle and a small trailer, that makes a good option for carrying a pontoon or multiple craft with one vehicle. This is a sturdy custom-made flatbed pontoon trailer. And this is a commercially available wire enclosed trailer. Now, once you get to the water, you may have to carry your craft a ways to the spot you plan to launch. Or when you have to get your craft back to your vehicle after fishing, you might have to carry it as well. If it's not too big or heavy, you can simply balance it on your head like this picture of me down in Mexico. Keeps the hands free for carrying rods and fins and hopefully fish back to the vehicle. In this picture with my old Kennebec, which is a mini pontoon, I'm using both my head and my hands to help steady the bigger and bulkier craft. And here's a picture of me transporting a larger and heavier tricked out fat cat. I'm using back straps attached to D-rings on the bottom of the craft, as well as a tump strap across my forehead. This allowed me to safely and comfortably transport my heavy tube several hundred yards from where I parked my vehicle to the spot I wanted to launch. Now, during the winters here in Utah, there's often a snow covering between parking and launching. No problem. With a craft like the Fat Cat that has a slick and protective PVC coating on the bottom, you can just attach a tow rope and make a tube sled. I've done this on several Utah lakes before and after ice up, of course. If it's going to be iced up when you get there, you can save your time and just watch TV. Now, as I grow older, my ability and desire to launch my float tube some distance away from where I park diminishes in direct proportion to the distance involved. And these days I almost always fish only where I can drive up and launch my float tube on a well-maintained boat ramp, especially with the motor and batteries involved. But many years ago, I began playing around with various wheel additions to enable me to haul my gear longer distances with less physical wear and tear. One of my first experiments was to buy a used baby stroller at a yard sale and to remove the wheels for making my first tube cart. And my first attempt was to make 2 separate dollies, one for each side of my Fat Cat. It worked fine, and when I got to where I wanted to launch my tube, I just removed the dollies and stowed them in the space behind the seat. That was before I motorized and I didn't have a tube or batteries to deal with. My next experiment with the stroller wheels is to make one single wide dolly to stretch all the way across the tube. And here's another version, worked very well also. Here's the single dolly again, stored for fishing. Okay, next we'll get into my adaptation of golf carts for tube transportation. This picture is of a commercially sold golf cart with an extension of PVC that I added on it to better stabilize the tube. This picture shows the golf cart tube cart loaded up with my old H3 Freestyle, just getting ready to trudge down to the water's edge and launch on Huntington Reservoir here in Utah. Here's a bottom view of how the tube is secured to the golf cart frame. And here's a picture of the golf cart being used for trudging my tube back into South Marina of Willard Bay when it was gated off during the winter. The ramp is still iced in, as you can see in the picture, but I was able to go up over the dike and launch the tube in open water in the newly thawed channel. Now, this shows the golf cart stowed for fishing and the results of an afternoon on Pineview Reservoir after trudging down the steep rocky trail with the golf cart. Now, here's a tube cart made by modifying a standard golf cart. And this is what it looks like installed on a tube. And this is the front view with the wheels installed on that modified golf cart. And again, on the steep rocky trail down to Pineview Reservoir, the wheels work fine to get the tubes down to the water, even on that rocky, uneven surface. Now, although this cart is kind of bulky, still fits in the back of a Fat Cat out of the way while fishing. It's ready to install for the trek back to the vehicle. Here's a picture of one of the PVC pull handles I've used for pulling the various carts around. It's pictured as part of a couple of other pictures, but this one shows it in better detail. Now, here's a deer cart tube truck. Once I added a motor and battery, I needed a bigger and sturdier cart to carry at any distance from my vehicle. I had experience in the past using a deer cart, obviously for hauling heavy deer, so I figured that might work. And it did, but I still prefer to launch at a ramp if I'm going motorized. This shows the deer cart loaded with a tricked out Fat Cat. The motor and battery are secured to the top of the load. It made it pretty heavy, and it was a chore moving it all down to the water, and even worse coming back up the steep hill on Deer Creek Reservoir, and that's why it never really got a lot of use. Also tried installing a set of those little pneumatic tires you can buy for wheelbarrows and the like, and they work pretty well. I used a similar frame as I made for the stroller wheels, and the finished dolly rode well on the back of the tube when stowed for fishing. While we're on the subject of wheels, here's a one-wheel transport system I rigged up on my pontoon, the Cougar, It's a bicycle wheel rigged up with a PVC axle and then secured to the footrests with screw-down hose clamp. Hey, it worked. The final entry in this segment is the PVC tube sled. There are places where a wheel cart just doesn't make it over large rocks or sticky mud or snow. So I engineered something with PVC. What else? Something that would ride up and over any of these things in style. Now, here it is with a tricked out tube all loaded up and ready to go. First over the rocks and then down across exposed mud to get to the water. And it worked. Here it is being towed the final step of the journey across the mud. Well, that finishes up this segment on transportation. Hope you got some ideas, maybe some good ideas. Okay, let's talk about PVC power. This includes the PVC components, basic tools, cutting, shaping, and joining, all that stuff you'll need to know if you're going to do some modifications. If you want to trick out your ride, you'll also need some basic mechanical skills and tools and components to create whatever modifications you have in mind. Now, this video segment will introduce you to these things, but I won't be providing complete step-by-step directions for all of the fabrication work on all of the PVC goodies that are pictured in this video. I had some basic instruction through work and other experiences, but most of what I think I know about PVC construction was learned through the trial and error process, and heavy on the error. Probably the best place to begin talking about the PVC modifications is the different sizes and types of PVC pipe that are available. Now, that is usually, sometimes they're not. You'll be able to use a half-inch pipe for some modifications, but only if there's not likely to be a lot of weight or torque applied to that modification. Now, for most rod holders, utility racks, sonar installations, and motor mounts, you probably want to use the larger 1-inch size pipe. And should seldom, if ever, need to use the bigger and heavier 1 1/4 inch pipe. Now, basically two kinds of pipe that we'll be talking about, the Schedule 40 and the Class 200, also known as thin wall. The former is a thicker wall and a heavier pipe, and it's good for making sturdier modifications, especially for something heavy like a big rod tree, or for screwing onto a wooden frame as a base for mounting things. But for rod tubes, you'll want to use a Class 200 1-inch pipe. It has a true 1-inch inside diameter, which is just right for most of the rear grips on spinning rods, and some of the other rods too. Whereas the heavier Schedule 40 1-inch pipe has an inside diameter of only 0.957 inches, and that's just a bit too small to accept most rod handles. This is a side-by-side picture showing the differences in thickness between the two types. And here we see some of the most common joints used for PVC construction: T's, angles, inline couplings, etc. Now, you will use crosses and three-way elbows in some cases, but not very often. Now, if you choose to glue your PVC joints, this is the best glue. It dries clear, and there are some that come in colors, but that can mess up the clean look if you get sloppy. On a lot of my PVC projects, especially experimental ones, I prefer to use small screws to join the joints rather than glue. That allows me to make minor adjustments or to completely disassemble it later and reuse the components without destroying them. I will mention also this has a number 10 by 3/4 inch screw. For a lot of my PVC connections, I use number 8 1/2 inch. So you'll just have to experiment and find what works best for you. This is an example of a rod rack, which the base part is securely fastened with screws, but the push-on connections of the rod holders is left unscrewed and unglued to allow for easy installation and swing-out positioning, and you can take them off when you're not using them. This picture shows how I install 2x2 wood frame inside the pockets to provide a base for screwing PVC pipe to the outside of the pocket for building rod holders and utility racks. Now in the pocket on the left side of the float tube, I also sometimes build in a little pocket to hold a small SLA battery for the sonar. This is the wood I use for the frames inside the pockets, 2x2 pine. The screws in the picture are actually for securing the wood inside the pocket, as will be seen in the next picture. The fabric on the outside of the pocket is pretty sturdy, but it's still wise to use a washer when attaching the wood to the pocket to kind of help reduce tearing. Okay, now let's look at some of the simple tools needed for PVC construction. First would be a PVC pipe cutter. Of course, you can use a hacksaw, but this tool's faster and easier unless you're trying to cut schedule 41 1/4 inch pipe. Then that's almost impossible. However, there are a lot of uses for a hacksaw, both the regular size and the little shorty versions, like cutting through crosses or T's to get mounting bases. And there are also some small power rotary saws that will work well on cutting PVC. This shows the first rough cut for making a connector base. And then you use a sander or a rotary tool with a sanding drum to smooth out the edges. The cut and smooth pieces can then be used to either attach to the base of a sonar display or to the metal frames of a pontoon as a place to push in a piece of PVC pipe for whatever modification you've got in mind. You'll also use that rotary tool with a 1/2 inch sanding drum to make grooves in the ends of PVC rod tubes. But if you're making a long groove for a fly rod, it's best to use some kind of a saw to cut 1/2 inch wide groove in it first and then use the rotary tool for smoothing out the edges. You'll also benefit by having a drill for making pilot holes in the PVC before screwing the pieces together. Then you can use a power screwdriver or a screwdriver fitting on your drill to put the screws in. Last tool I'll mention is a heat gun. PVC softens in heat and can be bent to a desired shape, or it can be flattened as shown here. It takes practice to learn the proper temperatures to heat the PVC before reshaping it, but it does allow you to fabricate some custom modifications. Well, that pretty much finishes up the discussion of PVC and also pretty much ends this whole video. Hope you guys found something useful and interesting out of it, and go out and pimp out your own ride.